Well, I want to thank you all for coming here today. I'm Shana Weinberg from the Center for the Study of Slavery and Justice, and I'm really pleased that we have Ann Chinn and Ann Cobb here today to talk about the Middle Passage Ceremonies and Port Markers Project. As many of you know, this is an initiative designed to address the transatlantic human trade, slavery, and remembrance, and it provides an opportunity for local residents, states, and the nation to begin to reconstruct traditional interpretations of an era in U.S. history that's wrought with shame, anger, denial, and guilt. And so today they're going to talk about the initiative's projects and discuss important and practical issues involved in doing this kind of public history and community engagement work. Ann Chinn is the project founder, and she's worked as an advocate for children and families in Washington, D.C., as a textile artist, a retailer, organizer of a collective artists market, and as a historian. Ann Cobb serves as the communications specialist, editing and preparing project materials such as press releases, grant proposals, correspondence, and blog posts. She's a former professor of English composition and literature at the Department of Humanities at Coppin State University in Baltimore. Along with Ann Chinn, she helps organize Middle Passage commemorative ceremonies and marker installations for African ancestors. So please join me in welcoming them here today.
Good afternoon, and thank you for coming. And I hope you'll enjoy your lunch as well. I'm just going to give you a very brief overview. Last time we were here was October 2013, and we went into in-depth discussion of the project. One of the comments of the participants at the last event was that we should not describe this as a project, but more as an initiative or a movement. Over the last 3 years, this project was established formally in 2011 as a nonprofit tax-exempt out of Florida. We have actually learned that that probably is a more appropriate description of what we're doing. We are literally taking history and the research off of the shelf and putting it on the street. And what we have been involved with are many lessons, one of which is to identify how to generate support and enthusiasm for the effort, and then how it will be sustained, not the project itself, but the interest and the involvement of local community in particular in supporting a history that for the most part, if not omitted and denied, has been interpreted in ways that are inaccurate. So what we would like for those of you who have any experience and involvement, after we've made the presentation, we'd like to have a discussion over particular points. I think that they were highlighted in the poster. We have...
I just wanted to say that over the last 2 years, I guess it is, we have done 9 remembrance ceremonies at arrival ports or slave ports in the United States. We've done them in Maryland, we've done them in Virginia, we did Baltimore, Annapolis, Sodderly Plantation on the Eastern Shore in Maryland, we did Philadelphia, Jamestown, Virginia, Yorktown, Virginia, Pensacola, Florida, St. Augustine, Florida. We've already done those remembrance ceremonies, and at 2 of those arrival sites, we've actually placed historic markers that identify these places as arrival ports, places through which Africans came directly from Africa to the New World.
There are, to piggyback on Ann's comments, there are 41 Middle Passage ports in the United States. They start in New Hampshire and go all the way around to Texas. And and that map over here would reflect that information. We have discovered, in the sense of Columbus, I guess, 2 additional ports, Oxford, Maryland, and Fredericksburg, Virginia. Fredericksburg, Virginia, until 2013, thought that it was only involved in what would be the domestic trade of captive people. We now know, based on records that came out of the New York Historical Society, that Africans were delivered directly to Fredericksburg. And this year, on a trip to the Eastern Shore, we learned that Oxford, Maryland will be added to the list of Middle Passage ports. And we're very clear about these ports. They are the ports where Africans arrived directly. They're not secondary ports, because actually if we were doing secondary ports, we would never finish this operation. So there are 41 where Africans literally, for the first time after crossing the ocean, set foot on land. We are insistent that this is not African American history in that sense that it's a very narrow focus. It is American history. It has to do with what this country is. And so that map there is not current as of this year. It's missing Oxford, Maryland. We have Sapelo Bay, which was actually the first place where a shipload of Africans were developed, were brought, and none of them, after a year when that Spanish colony had to end and go back to the Hispaniola, not a single African returned with them. They had all escaped into the Native American community, which is another consistent story in terms of resistance and escape. So that there are many stories that are intertwined with this project. I think that we will start with the points. We have focused on historical accuracy and perspective. And this project, or this initiative, addresses each and every one. We will give you examples. In Jamestown, Virginia, I think that all of us have historically been told that that is the place of first arrival of Africans into the United States. That's incorrect. There are 2 disputes in that history. One is the first Africans did not arrive at Jamestown. They arrived at Point Comfort, which is Hampton, Virginia. So that's the first bone of contention. And so that's the first historical, quote, fact that we challenged. The second is that it's not the first place that Africans arrived in North America. They actually arrived initially at Sapelo Bay and then into an established colony in St. Augustine in 1565. Florida beats New England at every juncture in terms of the first African descended child recorded occurred in St. Augustine. The first Africans brought to establish a permanent colony, it's not Virginia, it's St. Augustine, Florida. So that there are many things in terms of perspective and information that routinely over a couple of hundred years have been established as history that we're also addressing with this project. Another example is Yorktown, Virginia. People in Yorktown did not even know their history. They knew that they were a merchant port. They knew it was the port for Williamsburg. They did not realize that in a period of 78 years, 31,500 captive Africans were delivered to that port and then shipped to other regions of Virginia. As I said, Fredericksburg, Virginia did not know that it was a Middle Passage port, had only seen itself as a domestic trade port. Baltimore, Maryland, we're still under much discussion with that. In fact, we will have a meeting on Friday. They challenge that they are a Middle Passage port at all. They're willing to say they're a slave port. We are more concerned that these ports be marked, and we will encourage them to put a marker as opposed to argue about whether or not they're a Middle Passage port. There is documentation in Cuba that Africans were brought from Baltimore to Cuba, but that's not sufficient for Baltimore, so we will just push for the marker. Souderly Plantation, which represents the Patuxent region of Maryland, is one of the few places that jumped on the bandwagon with us, and they are in fact, they had a ceremony in 2012 in November, and they will place their marker November 1st of this year to mark the Emancipation Day 150th year for Maryland. That marker, in fact, is being paid for by the descendants of the plantation owners. So that is a remarkable story for us. As I said, Oxford, Maryland, we discovered this year, is a Middle Passage port. It is now a gentrified retirement community, very wealthy. But when approached, they have asked us to make a presentation to their city commissioner to see if a marker can be placed. But they're receptive. I think one of the reasons they're receptive is that most of the people who live there now are not the same people who were there originally. These are all newcomers. They don't feel threatened by the history. So they're willing to accept this designation for two reasons. It will encourage tourism and visiting. And it makes, again, for them, a great story for their area. We also tell them that this is probably the arrival site for the ancestors of Frederick Douglass and Harriet Tubman. So that, again, it's how you approach and how you frame this history. Norfolk, Virginia, we originally had identified as a Middle Passage port. The academics argued us down, even though they agreed that they had ships and they sent ships to Africa. Their argument was that all the Africans who were captured and delivered went to plantations. Absolutely none came to Norfolk. We find that unbelievable, but we're not willing to take on with so many battles. So Norfolk, Virginia has been eliminated. Annapolis is another interesting, development. Of course, it's based, and most of us are familiar with Annapolis, based on the Roots story that Alex Haley wrote. So the city was willing to accept the designation as a Middle Passage port, but ironically based on a lot of fictitious information. The Legionnaire did arrive in Annapolis. Whether that was with Haley's people, we cannot confirm. But at least they are accepting that as a Middle Passage port. And November 1st, as part, again, of the Maryland observance of Emancipation Day, 150th anniversary, they will put a marker at their port. Boston will have a ceremony and marker in 2015 in August 23rd, which is the International Day of Remembrance of the slave trade and its abolition that was established by the UN. Their enslavement is complicated. It involves both Native Americans and Africans, so that will be a very unique ceremony. Philadelphia, again, is not a problem. They recognize their role in the human trade and have an ongoing exhibit called Tides of Freedom at the Seaport Museum. Fernandina in Florida did not know that they were a major Middle Passage port until recently in 2012. They have now proclaimed themselves to be that, and we're in negotiations for a marker. There's already been a ceremony. St. Augustine is one of the most challenging cities that we've ever had to deal with. They promote their exclusive Spanish history, and we are asking that that history be reframed and be called African European settlement. In fact, in all of these areas, that is exactly what it is. Until the 1830s, 77% of the people brought into the Americas were Africans. That's, a substantial, 3 out of 4. That information just needs to be processed, and it's new to most people, I think. St. Simon's in Georgia is the site, I don't know whether you are familiar with Ebo Landing and Daughters of the Dusk, that film. There have been numerous ceremonies, but again, no markers. One of the things that we are hoping is that at least with these public markers, anyone will have access to this history. Yeah?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. Along with the importance of dealing with the historical accuracy and the historical perspectives, key to our moving forward as a project in terms of getting the ceremonies held as well as getting markers placed. Key to this is the local community. We can come in and present the Middle Passage Ceremonies and Port Markers Project and our mission, but in order to move from just the discussion of that to an actual ceremony and marker placement involves the local community, so that when we come in, we have got to try to identify key people in the community who would be useful to us. We found that the National Park Service has been incredibly supportive of everything we've done in a surprising kind of way, because we, for example, went into Virginia to meet with the Park Service thinking we might find a lot of resistance. But after about a 2-hour meeting, the superintendent of the Park Service said, "You have our complete support. We will handle the ceremony and fund the installation of the marker." And so once that happened, then the key players in the Jamestown, Yorktown area were able to bring together all these different folks in the local community, who then helped us make this mission of ours a reality in that area. So we found the National Park Service, the historical societies have been incredibly useful to us. Local community organizations, for example, in Richmond, there was a community of Native Africans who are now living in the United States, who were very useful in terms of getting the word out, in terms of organizing. We try to cast a wide net because Ann is based in Florida, I'm in Baltimore, Maryland, and so so we're actually coming from the outside in, and we find that if we can get the local community to take charge of it, not only will we have the initial remembrance ceremony and marker installation, but we will then hopefully have in place a core group who will make this thing not a one-time remembrance of the ancestors, but that it becomes a part of public history that's talked about, that's included in school systems, etc., churches, or whatever. And so if without the local community, it would be very difficult for our project to move forward beyond just the idea of what we want to do. We also have to include the media as we move forward, because they, whether it's print media or electronic, they are the ones who spread the word. So that we have not only the historical accuracy and historical perspective, but we also have to come in and make our mission a reality, and we do that by going through the local community. Not without sometimes some resistance sometimes, but ultimately we get together a core group that have, in the 9 ceremonies that we have had, have made our project come alive in these cities.
Yeah, I think that what Ann is basically saying is that it's an organizing effort more than anything else.
Mm-hmm.
Lead time in any area, hopefully statewide, but for each city is about 12 months. Minimum. Just from the introduction of the information and then identifying lead people in the community, and then having ongoing communication and support, so that it's continuous. Last year we were stretched to the limit. This year is a lot saner for us, but next year it gets back off again.
But we met in, say, October, I guess it was, in Boston, our initial kind of core organizational meeting, where different folks who were interested in what we were doing and had expressed their interest actually came together for our first meeting. So we had, again, the National Park Service, we had the folks from the meeting houses there, the gentleman who wrote Ebony and Ivy. We had a representative from the DeWolf family out of Rhode Island. So we had a large group of people who expressed interest, and from that point, they will break down into subgroups and begin to put together the ceremony, and then first the creation of the marker, how it's going to be written, how it's going to look, and the placement of the marker and the marker installation. The meeting was in October. The date is 2015 for the actual event to occur. So that kind of lead time is really necessary in order to make this thing happen the way we need to make it happen.
Yeah, and one of the other things is that we ask for 4 major components for each of the ceremonies, but what the ceremonies actually end up looking like are very distinct. And I'd encourage you to go to our website, and you can log in to any one of the ceremonies that have already been held and see the variety. We had a very plain one this past Saturday at Fort Mose in St. Augustine. Fort Mose is the first free community of black people in North America, if you don't count Mexico as North America. It was legally sanctioned. They were escaped people from Georgia and South Carolina. It was the first direction of the Underground Railroad. It was not north, it was south. People escaped either into Florida or Mexico, because those were Spanish territories. The Spanish were trying to undermine British colonies. I mean, so there's all this international play of history as well that's occurring, and black people are trying to take advantage of it to obtain their freedom. Well, Fort Mose had a ceremony, and it was, for me, a perfect example of what can happen if you don't continuously garner local support. There were exactly 20 people who came for an all-day observance of the history of civil rights in St. Augustine. It was not well publicized, and most of the people who came at the very end for the ceremony. They did not come for the rest of the activities. So it's crucial that as you're dealing with public history, as you are trying to encourage that this become valuable, that it become incorporated into the narrative of a locale, there's work that has to be done to keep it in the front. And without that, it becomes just what I think a lot of roadside markers are. They're there. But if you're driving 60 miles an hour, you don't see it. And a lot of people feel that, well, we fulfilled our obligation, you got the marker. But what are we doing with this history is an issue. In terms of issues around controlling and implementing, it is an organic process. Ann says, we're in one place, the markers of the ports are in another. There's just so much that we can control. It has to be that the local community decides what the ceremony looks like. Ultimately, they decide what the text will be for the marker and what activities will be included to sustain. We cannot. We have had, at one point, an issue about the text, and when we did not agree, we said we were pulling out. And this is after 8 or 9 months of working with the community. One group of people wanted one thing said, and it was inaccurate. And we had folks who said, look, you've got a marker for the first time reflecting Middle Passage history and African involvement in the establishment of an area. Why are you going to make it such an issue because it doesn't agree with what you know is correct? You're just going to walk out of this? And we said we have to, because there has to be a certain level of integrity. Yes. It was about whether or not Africans first arrived at Jamestown or Yorktown. I mean, it was Jamestown or Hampton, Point Comfort. Because I said one of the issues that we're finding is that we are challenging traditional information. And tourist dollars, visitors' dollars are dependent. Grant money. The dollar bill generation is an issue. And so when people see that as a threat, we keep saying, no, just fold it all in, But the issue of being the first, the only, got to get away from that. I mean, this history occurred, Whether I arrive first or Ann arrives first is not the primary issue. The primary issue is that both of us enslaved arrived here.
Yeah.
And that's what we are encouraging. Don't worry about whether it happened here first or there first. It happened. And what has happened to this locale based on this history.
So it was really wording,
Yeah.
the first Africans arrived, and we could not accept that, or at least have our name associated with that, since we knew for a fact and that it had been documented that was not correct, that was not accurate.
So those are the things that we have come up with. We also are right now in discussions at Fernandina. There's a person who has agreed to pay for the marker. We looked at what he proposed in terms of the text, glossed over the whole middle passage. He wants to talk about the Civil War, you know. And I said, no, that's not what this is about. And so now we've got to go back and form another committee to deal with that text, to see if, in fact, you know, they will incorporate that, about the middle passage. Fernandina was a major smuggling point for Georgia and South Carolina after the constitutional ban on the importation of Africans. So we have to work it out. And if it ultimately does not reflect historical accuracy from what we know, we won't have our logo put on that marker. I mean, that's the sort of I guess the good seal. What is it, the good housekeeping seal? If you see our logo, it means that we have supported that text for that place. The final issue, and then I'd really like to open this up for questions, is the integrating of the historical information. And how do you do that? Virginia has their state education people who have attended both marker and ceremony programs at Yorktown and Jamestown, and they are talking about how they will put this into the state curriculum. We have, I'm trying to think who else, Virginia and oh, I know what the other was, South Carolina.
Oh, okay.
In South Carolina, and this was number one, 60% of all the Africans who came into the United States came through Charleston. But in South Carolina, if you look at what is standard in African American history, not only do they not talk about the Gullah Geechee culture, which extends from North Carolina down to Florida, you don't get African American history until middle school, and the segment on it deals with the gin, what's his name?
The boxcar.
No, the guy who did the cotton.
Oh,
Thank
okay.
you.
Oh, the cotton.
Mr. Whitney, yes, who invented the cotton gin.
Uh-huh.
That's the story that the kids in South Carolina get. They don't get that this was where 60% of enslaved Africans came. They don't get the rice culture. They don't get the indigo culture. They get the cotton gin. You know, so there's this deliberate or otherwise intent to separate so that people don't see the thread of their own existence, even in state history, so that we are really pushing that the groups that are involved in education, in particular history, local history and state history, that they become part of this initiative and that we have discussions with them. You know, there's so much that is omitted or twisted or denied.
Mm-hmm. And that is our big dilemma as an organization. Again, is having the ceremonies, placing the markers, then what? Because yes, it's important that the markers be placed and that we acknowledge this history, But again, it's got to be something that has to be integrated into the community, a way of looking at American history in a way that has not been looked at before, and including an entire group of people, not only an entire group of people, but the people who made this America possible as we know it today. And how to begin to include these people into that public history so that Ann and I can do the ceremonies. Then what? It would be like Igbo Landing that is now overgrown.
Marsh.
Yeah, it's a marsh now, even though they had a big ceremony in the early 2000s, I guess, but then if you look at it now, it's just marshland. And so of what value is that in terms of, if you're trying to change the perception of history? And that's where we find ourselves asking this question, talking about this between ourselves, like where does it go from here? Because it involves education, it involves politics, it involves so many things, and you have to have people who are willing to put that energy into it. And not every place is a tourist area, say like Florida, who can actually see a value. Florida, especially after the Trayvon Martin thing, a lot of African Americans have been staying out of Florida. For Florida, they can look at this and say, maybe this is a way we can bring African Americans back. And they might see a value to that. Okay, it is $1 bottom line, but I mean, they can see that, but not every place is like that. So how do you begin to take this history and integrate it into the community and into public history? And that's the question.
Yeah, and I think another perfect example, I don't know how many of you have been to Jekyll Island in Georgia. I mean, it's a tourist area. I went there in March by invitation and took a tour. This is the same person who took me to Igbo Landing. Jekyll Island has a marker and extensive information publicized. Beautiful place. They've done a sailboat, a clipper in fact, out of copper tubing. All the information is there. There's absolutely no signage. You come across that bridge, there's nothing that says, arrival site of the Wanderer, which is one of the last of the ships that brought Africans. They smuggled them in to Georgia in 1854, I think. This is, years after the constitutional ban. Everything is there. But if you didn't know it was there, there's nothing the state has put, or the local people have put nothing there to even mark it, so that you would know, make a right at 3/4 of a mile, you'll see this. So there are issues about how it's incorporated and how it's capitalized as well, in terms of, and I'm not just talking monetary, I'm talking about the value of the history and the sense of it. And so now I would like to just open it up to questions, if you have any. Yes? They're basically the historical groups. Who may come, they've heard about the project, they heard it happened in another city, want to know what they can do in theirs. Sotterley was, I think, the first of the sites that approached us, because it's a plantation. And in fact, we had, based on the Voyages database that Eltis and Richardson produced, and they're still updating, and they do the information on all the Middle Passage and arrival sites where Africans were either brought from Africa or from the West Indies to the United States. All we had was Patuxent. We had no idea. I mean, Patuxent River is huge in terms of Maryland, and we would just put Patuxent down, and it was like, we don't have any idea exactly where. And the lady who was the educational specialist at the plantation happened to go to a Maryland Commission meeting where our project was being explained to people who had attended. And she contacted us and asked, she says, I have information that the plantation owners were agents for the Royal African Company, and that our plantation owner was bringing in Africans into the western Chesapeake and making deliveries both in Virginia and Maryland. Do you think it's a possibility that we can talk? So it's a range. You know, sometimes it's been us going and trying to identify we have the information, who do we give it to? Who can we interest? And then in other times, it's the local community contacting us. It's word of mouth a lot, yes. Well, one of the things that we had said is that in like Virginia and actually Florida also, there are particular groups that are advocating in South Carolina, advocating to have the curriculum altered or to incorporate this information. We are also beginning a discussion with Teaching for Change and the Howard Zinn Project to find out if there would be social studies teachers in middle school and high school who would be willing to generate the names of enslaved people and the African descended families in particular locales and states based on census records. The name of the project for them is From Numbers to Names, so that the children would be generating actual names. It would also help people who are trying to search for their own family histories. If they have a name, if they have a state, if they have a city, that they would go. The children are going to hopefully look in primary sources. One of the things that we have an intern here a student intern here at Brown who has been researching. When she went to do New England, she was amazed to find that there were only 3 names identified in early records, early formal records, tax records. However, we do know that if you go into the personal journals and diaries, that you will pull the names of people. So that will be the second phase for New England. It will be 2 things. Children will be learning how to use primary sources. And they will also be establishing a database for cities and states, and so that people can use it. So it's again, it's a process.
This is about, as you put it, continuity and community support, and it's a question about links tying the Rhode Island, the Middle Passage, to Sierra Leone in West Africa, and Charleston. I'm curious as to what ideas you might have about bringing more to Rhode Island. About it's a project. There was a movie a documentary that was just shown. It had its premiere in mid-March in Charleston, the Charleston Film Festival, called Priscilla's Legacy. Oh, good. You know, were you there? Okay, I'm very happy I got to go and see it, and some people here might be aware of the whole Priscilla story, but I was thrilled that this film was made. If some of you saw Henry Louis Skip Gates's the very first of the 6 segments of the American Experience program that was recently shown, this story was featured in from the very beginning in this, and it, I'm not sure if you know that, let's see, in 2006, the North Charleston school teacher, Tomlin Martin Polite, who was the 8th generation granddaughter of Priscilla, who was kidnapped from what's now Sierra Leone and brought on a Rhode Island-owned slave ship, the Hare, across on the Middle Passage to Charleston. And there are lots of Rhode Island ties to that story, and connecting South Carolina, Charleston, and where Priscilla was sold at auction in 1765. So you know, the people who made the film, and Tomlin Martin Polite, who's now 41, even though when we went back to Sierra Leone with her in 2005 on this African homecoming that Brown's professor James Campbell was part of. You know, they've been working on movies about this and trying to strategize on ways to bring it back to Rhode Island, ways to connect it to Brown and Providence, because there's so many ties. So I know I've done a lot of meandering and all that, but the story takes place at Sierra Leone, and it's Middle Passage, and it's Charleston, and it's Rhode Island. So I'm hoping that more will be done to publicize that history in this area.
Yeah.
Well, there are a couple of things that are going on, particularly in South Carolina. Charleston is in the process of building or organizing to build a museum related to the Middle Passage. And as I said, 60% of the Africans who came into the U.S. territory came through the port of Charleston. So that they will be doing a lot. The story of Priscilla, I always like to use that example because James Campbell in his book says, and I think it says it strongly for us in terms of this project, is that we not only lost our ancestors, but Africans lost theirs. You know, it's not just that we lost the connection. So that we are really looking at this project as a means of healing and closing the broken circle. Mm-hmm. There, certainly in Rhode Island, Providence, we found on our last trip, does have a marker. You have it right down on your river to the arrival of Africans. We're trying now to encourage the city of Bristol, which is the home of the DeWolf Trading Center, to have a formal marker. They have a little plaque by a lodge, a cafe, that says something about Africans came here, like they were taking a tour. You know, we would like to say that the family that helped establish Bristol, Rhode Island, were involved in the trade, and they were involved in the trade even after 1809. They delivered folks to Cuba. Okay, can't take them to U.S. Right. Take them to Cuba or somewhere else. I mean, this was money, and it was money up and down the coast. They may have delivered folks to Charleston. They also brought them up and delivered them in Connecticut and in Rhode Island.
Yeah.
Bristol is presently very resistant to having this marker.
We have met with two, as I said, of the descendants, James, and another cousin who spent quite a bit of time with us when we were here, and they made it quite clear that there is a, even though,
Well,
and it's
yeah,
not just them.
you know what it is. I think that sometimes it's hard to clean up your own backyard. You know, you can go all around and deal with everybody else's, but you can be a little bit hesitant to push too hard with your neighbor.
And they did, you know, they have offered to support what we're doing, but it's more, again, trying to get that local community, because you need that. It's not just one or two people who can make it happen, but you got to have a core group of local folks that are willing to push for that. And yeah, it's...
I guess I made the wrong assumption that economic incentives of tourism and so
Yeah.
on would be enough to
Yeah,
transcend that resistance.
we're hoping some.
Oh,
Okay.
all right.
As some or all of you probably know, the only great house extant, so it's become a symbol of the transatlantic trade and northern complicity, and I embraced that when I became director 10 years ago. I felt morally we were compelled to do that, and we have really come a long way. We have a regularly scheduled, what I call an Africana theme tour, where you meet at Linden Place. A guide shows you all of the buildings in town connected to the slave trade. It sells out every month. We've had a whole range of programming, largely executed by the DeWolf descendants. Elizabeth Sturgis Lorena had an amazing show. I embraced that, I promoted it. I have to tell you, though, the bigger issue, the challenge is that there just aren't enough hours in the day for your typical understaffed historical society. Two of us, I'm in charge of 5 buildings on 2 acres. I'm in charge of lectures, concerts, summer camps. Our bread and butter, because that house is my expensive mistress. She's not cheap to keep up in the style to which she's grown accustomed. We have 56 weddings to pay the bills. So where in the scheme of things, and you know, I've always deeply admired Katrina's passion and Elizabeth's passion, but sometimes their well-meaning passion doesn't translate when, you know, and I sent them an email and saying, as much as this is an amazing idea, I embrace this, that's why I'm here. But Katrina and Elizabeth are going to have to come to town and do a little bit more than propose a great idea, which is typically what I see as director of an understaffed, you know, overwhelmed historical society and historic house museum.
Yeah.
Well, please make sure we have your contact information. One of the things that I would like to say is that, you know, these markers are not cost prohibitive, $2,500. I mean, you know, it's like when we went to Baltimore and proposed the marker, and the guy said, how much, what is it? And also in the Fredericksburg, how much, what is it? I said, a wayside marker, 30 inches by 60 inches, with a text that talks about the middle passage on one side and the role of the community on the other side. $2,500 at the most. No, we're not talking metal, we're not talking stone. We are talking weatherproof, you know, but it's not a great expenditure.
Well, and I embrace, you know, again, what you were talking about in terms of, you know, the historical piece. I was so inspired by President Simmons and the establishment of the Slavery and Justice Commission, and, you know, and the importance of educating future generations. And that's, to me, I agree, is more important than the piece of stone. And I think Bristol's, you know, there's been some progress, but having said what I said, I also agree there's a lot of resistance. I'm sure you won't find it in the curriculum there. And I grew up in Newport. We were never taught about Newport's involvement either. So there's still a lot of room for progress.
So make sure we have.
And you gotta ask though, you know, because if you don't ask, it would never happen. So, I don't know how, that's all we would do is walk into a city and present the project, this is what we would like to do. And each one is gone off from there. And I know that there is a lot of resistance in Bristol. And getting that local group together could be really difficult, but I don't feel it's impossible. I think it would just take a commitment to try to do it, I think.
Well, and I was encouraged when you mentioned Boston because what struck me when I first sat down was all of your N's, your no's are all in New England, most of them anyway.
All of our,
No marker, no ceremony. Yeah, it kind of
marker,
struck
no
me that sort of
ceremony.
New England is.
yeah.
I have a question about whether the National Park Service has any sites that are now acknowledging or marking the transatlantic slave trade. How would that come to be? Where should it be if it would be a national park site?
Well, of course, we have the Jamestown and Yorktown, both up by National Park Service. Boston, National Park Service
But
is
the park is
spearheading.
about much larger, different.
National Park Service has just been
They've
amazing.
been wonderful, incredible.
And it's really funny because almost all the superintendents, my question after the markers go up is, so when does this go into some kind of registry so that people, when they're planning their trips or they want to know what's available in their cities, when are you going to put this in? And they go, we could. It'll be in, it's almost like, as opposed to asking for permission through the Department of Interior, we found it's much easier to go through the superintendents at the locales. So that Fredericksburg, the same way, just to go directly to the local National Park Service superintendent or assistant superintendent and begin that discussion. Because they're the people who they're boots on the ground. I mean, they know why people come. They're the ones who are managing these sites for the most part. And they're very receptive. At least we found them to be receptive.
Can you say a little bit about about this question of tourism and these sites? It seems to me that there's perhaps some contradiction in what your project is trying to do and the way that some institutions see this as an easy source of tourism dollars. And I'm wondering how you grapple with that distinction.
I would say keep nipping at people's heels. In particular, this is ongoing in St. Augustine right now. I mean, they're selling Spanish history, and we're selling American history.
Forgive me if I do not understand the entire dynamics of what you're saying, but is there not some way where you can merge the tourism dollars with what you want? See, you would like this place with a marker, you would like them to remember the history. But if they do not want to remember it, say the people who brought in the slaves will resist. Those who came in are not particularly proud of it, they would like to forget. But it is history and it must be there for posterity. So would it be possible to have a non-conflicting method? Where somehow I do not know. I'm not in any position to give advice, but I was just wondering if there is a non-conflict method, where the people who came are proud and they want to keep it, and maybe the tourism question he was asking about, is there some way of being inclusive about both? I mean, can they be a via media there? serving your purpose. I'm
I
not saying-
think, I think there is. I mean, I think that that's pretty much what we do. I mean, we don't do an either, well, we do an either or if it becomes false information. I will tell you that. But short of that, like I said, in Baltimore doesn't want to support itself at this point as a middle passage point. They said, okay, how about a slash point? They went, okay. And that's it. I mean, you know, it's you do negotiate.
But I can also say, in tradition and practice, there's a resistance across the board. For example, I gave tours for 20 years through high school and college and after of the Gilded Age houses in Newport. And when you go on tour there, the focus is on the architecture and the social history and the collection. And they don't talk about how Commodore Vanderbilt, who in industrializing America, you know, the horrors of building the railroads and how people were treated, and it just isn't normally done in the museum field, if you will, where that's part of the interpretation. So I don't think it's just limited to this. I think it's kind of across the board.
Right. I mean, you know, to tell the full story of American history, it's
Right.
messy.
Yeah.
That's the best way to put it. But I don't think that it harms to reveal the mess.
No,
it
it should
doesn't-
be done. I'm just saying it hasn't been. I agree. It should be
Yeah.
done.
I mean, I think that to put the ugly out there with the good is okay. I mean, it's just, it can't be all good. You know? And again, there are lessons to be learned. There are interpretations. And then it gives us a better understanding, I think, of who we are. You know? It's not always pretty, and it's not always easy. You know, if I had known what we have gone through so far, you know, I sometimes wonder if I would have started this. But it's also rewarding.
No, when I saw John Brown's house museum here, the photos on the wall there, the ship that brought in the slaves, the fact that, you know, even without them focusing on it, you do get a sense of the slave trade and how terrible it must have been to make one of the brothers become a Quaker and quit the. So even sometimes, you know, without intending to, I think things come through. So I was wondering if, you know, even if there is this resistance, just not destroying something, just letting that picture of the slave ship be, even if it is, you know, if they're not going to talk about it, might help.
Yeah.
Something like that.
Yeah.
Because I'm a tourist and so.
Yeah, I mean, that is basically what we want. I mean, we just want the information out there for people to process it on whatever level they can process that information. I told Dan the story of going to my doctor, I don't know, 6 months or so ago, and she asked me what I was doing, and I was telling her about the project. She's a young, maybe 35, 38-year-old physician, white American woman, and I was telling her about the project and how we had installed the marker at Yorktown. And she said, I'm taking my kids to Yorktown for Easter. Or she's taking them to Jamestown for Easter. And I said, well, be sure to go to Yorktown as well, because we have installed this marker. Her children are like 8, 10 years old. She thought it was so wonderful because she said that slavery is such a difficult subject to even begin to talk about as a part of America's history, that by she never quite knew how to do it, although she didn't want to keep information away from her children. And she thought that, well, by taking them to this marker, that will open up the dialogue. One is 8, one is 10. They're not going to be asking any super complicated questions, but it opens a door for a dialogue that can continue as the kids get older and begin to observe other things about America, or learn different things about American history. It's just a way of opening the door, and she thought that the marker was great and that it would be really useful to her and her children on that level. So, yeah, it's just, we're not trying to, do anything beside get the information out there and then let the discussion begin.
Yeah, and also we had the ceremony and marker installation on Friday, August 23rd, in Jamestown, and someone who had attended the ceremony stayed over the weekend and said that what they had done was to go back to Jamestown that Sunday before they left, just to look at it one more time. And they said a busload of people had just come down to the shore, and everybody was reading it. That's what we want.
Amazing.
That's exactly what we want. That information is accessible.
And it's interesting, the National Park Service put that marker, it's not over in the corner anywhere. You see the huge monument to the British there, and then you walk toward the water, and the next thing you see is our marker. And it's just to have that balance for the first time since the beginning is to us a major achievement. Yeah.
So would you consider that to be your most successful ceremony and marker?
They've all been so different. They've all been unique. They've had their moments, unexpected and unplanned. And, it's really hard to say. Our first one in Baltimore, we had one at dawn and one at dusk. And the one at dawn was a totally spiritual, amazing. We didn't even expect that many people to come, and we had so many people there. And it was just the whole thing of being at dawn on the harbor there, and it was just beautiful and moving. We had Bernice Johnson Reagan from Sweet Honey in the Rock. She sang for us there. And, so each one has had its, our National Park Service superintendent, who's practically in tears as he's speaking. He's so, emotionally moved by the placement of the marker there. So they've all had these wonderful moments that it'd be hard to say which one was. Annapolis was, just a regular day, and then we did our ceremony, and there was an African dance troupe there, and the leader of the troupe was so moved by the remembrance ceremony that he led the entire, everybody was there in an old African dance to the ancestors. He just asked if he could do that, and the next thing you know, it was this huge crowd of people who didn't know the dance at all, but he kept it simple, and that was, again, a moving experience. Also in Annapolis, we had ships. There's an African-American sailing group that came into the shore at dusk as we were doing the ceremony with chimes, bells, drums, and stuff. So you had the boats coming into the harbor and the drums on the harbor, doing that kind of call and response thing at sunset. And that was another just amazing experience. So all of them have been really beautiful and quite unique, though.
And some we've heard about. There was one in Baltimore this past summer that was organized again by another sailing club. And they picked up the traditional African priest and took him out into Baltimore Harbor, and other ships came to that ship, and they did drumming and a libation. Like I said, it's organic. We don't dictate but just for people to make a connection, to understand that we're not like topsy religious, or,
Yeah.
you know.
There's certain things that we want in there. We want to have, of course, the libation. There's certain things that we request our organization in terms of the structure of the remembrance ceremony. The historical statement, we request that there be a diversity of representatives. It's not an African thing. You know, we weren't all, you know, we were Muslims when we came over here. We were traditional, practiced traditional African religions. They're, Christians, Jewish, you know, so we're not making it narrow like that. We want it to be all inclusive. So that's a request that we make for every ceremony. Yeah, Native Americans, we always ask that Native Americans open the ceremony, as this was their land before it was anybody's land. And so they began to, for every ceremony, they had burned sage and done chanting or whatever. A chief or some representative of a local tribe has done that for us for every single ceremony. So those are things that we ask, but the rest of it kind of happens organically, like I said. I guess that's what makes each one quite unique.
They're all on paper.
Yeah.
We're like mothers.
Yeah,
We love all our children.
Well, thank you both for coming. There's a lot more food. There's a sign-up sheet back there, so if you want to get emails from the Middle Passage Initiative. But thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank
Thanks for
you.
having us.
Thank you.